Opening night of the NHL season is finally here, and we've already had a few games with some big score lines, and we're finally getting a look at Utah. Find out more on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, of course, is going to be fun. It is the first day, well, I wouldn't really say first day because technically the NHL season started last week, but was anyone really watching Buffalo and New Jersey? Gotta be honest, I was not. It was an afternoon set of games in, Sweden or something? And I just, when it's in the middle of the workday, I almost feel like it might as well be preseason. I mean, these games happen when preseason's still going on, so very, very interesting. But for me, I think the real start of the season is tonight. And we've already had a couple of really big games. We've seen Seattle and St. Louis go at it. Boston and Florida wrapped up their game just not too long ago. And right now we're in the first intermission of Utah and Chicago, which for us is going to be interesting because this is the first time that we're getting a look at Utah proper. And I know you're going to say, oh, but it's just the Arizona Coyotes. And that is true to a point, but there's a couple of key differences. There are some new arrivals to the roster, and, all the off-ice drama that really surrounded the Yotes is gone, which is a big, psychological weight off of the shoulders of many players who I think would pretty much tell you it was a huge distraction and, honestly not great for the mental health of a lot of the players. So we'll dive into some early observations from Utah's game as well. But before we go too much further, just wanted to let you know that tonight's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet, and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Now, like I said, the first couple of games, I was tuning in for at least a good bit of Seattle versus St. Louis, and then ended up skipping Bruins-Panthers, although I was sort of watching from the side, just not that closely. And I managed to catch a little bit of Utah and Chicago. But I think for the St. Louis-Seattle game, what was kind of interesting was the Kraken were fairly in control of this one. They were up 2-0. And then towards the back third of the game, everything started to come unglued. And within 5 to 10 minutes, Seattle went from a 2-0 lead to a 3-2 deficit and was just not able to really recover. Jordan Kyrou scored a brace and obviously had a big game. And I think this is going to be a very interesting template for St. Louis because the Blues, to me, this year are not going to be that great of a team. I think they're going to be one of those squads that can hit you on the counter, but generally speaking, I'm not expecting them to be that great. I think, if you're looking at their roster, the depth, and the aging of this group and sort of the changeover that they're dealing with, I'm not overly convinced that they're going to be a top contender in the Central Division, but if they do kind of cause problems in the middle of the pack, that wouldn't shock me. And the fact that they were able to rally after a really bad start, a really bad first half of this game, I think is definitely a testament to some of the skill and quality that they still have, despite, kind of being I don't even know if I could call them like a retooling kind of team or something. I feel like the Blues have tried to just keep things going ever since they won the Cup, and it's had mixed results, but at least for Blues fans, they tend to be in the peripheral of at least a wild card spot or something, and maybe that'll be the case again this year. But if you're Seattle, you're probably wondering how this could have happened, right? Baalsma seemed like he had things kind of cooking with the Kraken, and then it all just sort of came apart at the seams on a couple of mistakes, a couple of bad plays, and suddenly, the Kraken were down and were not able to find those game-tying opportunities. So interesting first game, but, obviously don't read too much into it as it is just the first outing, but some interesting stuff that could be relevant for the Jets if the Blues become a pain this year. The Bruins and Panthers played a massive offensive game. The Panthers, frankly, ripped through Boston until, I would say, the third period. And then Boston started clawing back a couple of goals. But that one resulted in a 6-4 scoreline for the Panthers. Obviously, Florida coming off of a Stanley Cup victory, riding real high. That's just a really good team. They've also just announced the extension of Carter Verhaeghe, huge, massive deal. Obviously, a big extension, and for it being an 8-year, $7 million per season kind of contract, I think they made the right choice. I think Verhaeghe's great, and I think that this Panthers team does have some tough decisions in the offseason about some of their expiring free agents. But make no mistake, they'll probably be up there if, in fact, this team doesn't have the Stanley Cup hangover. Now, in terms of the Bruins, of course, Swayman didn't play, having not really practiced a lot recently, and so Korpisalo kind of got the call, and yeah, things probably could have gone better. Hard to really hang the loss on him, but if you're talking about how important it was for the Bruins to not lose probably their main method of getting into the playoffs, Swayman's value is probably going to become very apparent over the next few months. Now, the game you probably want to know the most about, first period of Utah-Chicago, what did we see? And you know what? Utah looks like they've got some juice. This team is fast. I think they're skilled. And while they didn't generate a ton of shots on goal, they generally limited the Hawks to just one shot or two shots maybe, really didn't give them any time or space, and took advantage of some really bad turnovers and mistakes that ended up costing the Hawks a couple of goals. The most impressive play was probably Dylan Genther's goal. He just absolutely ripped one with a quick, almost like snapshot of sorts. Great trailing skater right down the slot, and this was a second play that ended up happening with the second goal. I think it might have been Schmaltz who tucked this one home, or Keller, one of those two. A very similar construct to the Genther goal, and just really impressive to see how good Utah was at using these small spaces and cutting straight down the middle, creating some chaos, getting Chicago into some really bad mistakes, and honestly just pouncing and taking advantage. The fan base seems pretty energized, like 34,000 in attendance, if I recall correctly. Very lively group, and it seems like the Utah squad has energy and sort of a renewed focus now that things are not as chaotic off the ice. In terms of the roster, too, this Utah group is pretty interesting. Genther obviously is going to be a big add, but, you've got a more experienced Cooley, Michelli, Hayton, Keller, Schmaltz. I mean, this is a good squad. Like, Krause is on their third line now, where he's probably best suited. And if that's your top nine, on top of having, Jack McBain as, a supporting supplementary winger or complementary winger, I mean, this is a pretty solid roster in a team that could probably make the playoffs. On defense, you've got Sergachev and Dirtzy, Valimaki and Kesselring, and then Cole and Kolyachonok. I hope I pronounced that right. On your third pairing, which, the third pairing aside, I think this group is going to be mobile and fast. And, Torney might honestly get this team cooking if he can keep, the roster relatively healthy, and they can avoid some of, the youthful mistakes that we often see with new teams. This squad, I really wouldn't call it new. I mean, they're technically a first-time franchise here in Utah, but let's be real, right? It's still the Arizona Coyotes, just without some of the crazy pressures off the ice that they felt earlier. So, impressive first period. We'll see if they can maintain it. But, of course, in just a little bit, the Jets are going to be taking on the Edmonton Oilers. In that game, yeah, let's just say that Winnipeg's probably an underdog. We'll talk about our matchup against the reigning Stanley Cup finalists in just a little bit. But before we go too much further, did want to shout out our friends and partners at FanDuel. NFL fans, you could start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Obviously, the first 5 weeks of NFL action have been pretty crazy. As a Ravens fan, I've felt every sort of emotion, sadness at first, frustration, And then just unrequited or just unrelenting joy, I guess you could say. Ravens Bengals is going to be one of the games of all time that you just remember if you're a Ravens fan or even a Bengals fan. And if you are a Cincy fan, sorry, Burrow played his heart out. Amazing game though. And either way, if the Ravens had lost, I probably would have accepted it. But a lot of you are also Vikings fans. You're probably loving the impressive display that the Vikings D has put on. They have been shut down, and maybe you're getting a hunch in some of those games where you're thinking, this might be a team that's destined for greatness. If you want to follow up on that hunch, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you're placing your bets at FanDuel. And you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. That's all with FanDuel.com. Go to FanDuel.com right now and get in on the action this moment. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on today's episode as we are just, we're checking in on the start of the season. Obviously, Winnipeg is starting tomorrow. Gonna be a big game. We're taking on one of the big Stanley Cup finalists in Edmonton, and the Oilers. If you look at the survey of media folks and personalities, I believe it was either TSN or Sportsnet, they all basically said Edmonton are their cup favorites. And I think the Oilers are an easy pick for a couple of reasons. A, they made the cup finals last year. And B, the field this year feels maybe a little underwhelming somehow. I don't think that there are many clear-cut on paper Stanley Cup favorites right now. I think that'll change over the next few months, but your usual cast that you're going to talk about is probably what makes the most sense. Edmonton, the Panthers, Dallas, who else? Gosh, in terms of clear-cut teams, I mean, I don't know. Carolina has kind of declined. Probably the Rangers. I think the Rangers are a fairly strong team. Maybe Toronto. To me, I think the Leafs are going to be bad this year relative to their standards. I think they're going to take a step back. But otherwise, there's not a lot of teams that I'm immediately thinking of as top-end contenders. Even the Avs have kind of taken a little bit of a step back, and they're going to have some issues until they can figure out what to do with Nichushkin and Landeskog. I think Nichushkin is due back sometime over the next couple weeks or months, but Landeskog, obviously a bigger hole to fill. So for the Jets, this is going to be an interesting test against what is right now on paper one of the best teams in the league. And of course, it just happens to be your first game on the road. So Winnipeg is most definitely an underdog. I think Winnipeg is probably going to lose this game. I'd love to have a measure of confidence in their ability to put on a big road performance. But let's be honest, right? This Oilers team actually got better this offseason. Their forward lineup is actually pretty impressive, man. It's frustrating to say this, but somehow after losing in the Cup Finals, they honestly got better. Nugent Hopkins, McDavid, and Hyman anchor your first line. Skinner, Draisaitl, and Arvidsson anchor your second. Janmark, Henrique, and Brown are on your third. And Podkolzin, Ryan, and Perry are on your fourth. And then on defense, you've got a pretty interesting group. This is maybe where you do feel that there's a weakness. Outside of Ekholm and Bouchard, the blue line is a little bit on the rough side. You've got Nurse and Emberson as your second pairing, and then Kulak and Stetcher as your third. Now, the third pairing I actually do kind of like. Kulak and Stetcher, I think, are probably a solid third. The second pairing, though, with Nurse is going to be really high event and probably for both teams. So if there's a matchup that the Jets maybe want to take advantage of, I could see that being the case. But the biggest problem for Winnipeg in this game is that McDavid's going to play like a billion minutes. And even if you slow McDavid's line down or if he somehow doesn't score, you've got to contend with a fairly deep top nine. Skinner is still a great finisher. Draisaitl is still elite at being, a pure offensive menace. Arvidsson's very underrated. I've always liked Victor, and I think he didn't really... I don't think he had the best tenure with the Kings, but he's still really talented, and so long as he stays healthy, he is a great complementary player. Henrique on your third line with Janmark and Brown, I mean, that's going to be a frustrating group just because they may not be like the most offensively potent, but their skill and some two-way responsibility there. And, Henrique is the guy that the Jets did want to bring in and ended up not signing, which, I personally would not have been upset to see him join Winnipeg, but obviously I don't think he would have solved our 2C problems off the bat. The fourth line, Winnipeg can probably match this. I guess we're going to ice Cardio Kupari and our friends out there with, Barron and Iafallo. So I think that actually aligns pretty nicely with a matchup advantage for the Jets in this case. But I think the biggest problem that I have with Winnipeg's lineup is, it's the same as we saw in the end of preseason. CSV, Perfetti, Nemesnikov, and Ehlers. The massive third line with Lowry, and then Barron, Kupari, and Iafallo on your fourth. And if this first line gets caved in, like I'm pretty sure it's going to be, it just makes everything hard for everyone else. That's really the biggest problem is if Connor, Scheifele, and Velarde can't get things together, no one else is really going to be able to pick up the slack. I mean, I love this Perfetti and Ehlers combo, but they're not going to be able to outscore McDavid. I'm sorry, that's just not happening. Unless we get really fortunate and somehow McDavid slows down or isn't able to convert on as many opportunities because Hellebuck is Hellebuck, I have a really hard time seeing who else is going to win this matchup. They've tried to use the Lowry line against McDavid before, and it hasn't really gone that well. Lowry does sometimes have the better of Connor at times, but that's pretty infrequent. And we just know that Scheifele's line is not able to do that either. This is where Ehlers, Scheifele, and Velarde probably would have been more helpful. If you can keep the possession out of your own end, especially when McDavid is on the ice, that opens up so much more for your other three lines to at least try and make some hay against the matchups you can win. Because, Winnipeg's offensive depth is nowhere near as good as Edmonton's. The Oilers just have elite scoring up and down their lineup, and I think the Jets are in for a tough game. But Winnipeg has gone through this before where they've been heavily outgunned and they've still beaten Edmonton in the past. I don't know that this is going to happen for your season opener, especially on the road, but we'll see how Arniel does. I don't know that I love these lines, and I don't know that I really feel confident about the season in general. I'm not going to sit here and say that I would have felt better with the rookies either, but at least I would have felt like the kids are a different thing. They're new. They're not what we're used to. And sometimes even just having something novel and interesting to watch is maybe a draw for a fan, right? It's not the same old tired thing that we know is not going to work in the playoffs. It's going to be fine for the most part in the regular season, but that's never really the concern with the Jets. It's when they make the playoffs that, Winnipeg's vulnerabilities really become a pressing matter for them to address. So, yeah, it is what it is. On defense, it's going to be Morrissey, DeMello, Sandberg, Pionk, and Fleury Miller. All I can say is clench up because I think it's going to be a tough night. Pionk in your top four is going to be a problem. Fleury and Miller, I think Miller's going to have to do more of the heavy carrying on that pairing. And I love Morrissey and DeMello, but DeMello, he is starting to slow down. And against McDavid, the speed issue might be a problem. So I'm just not really expecting a lot from this game. I wouldn't be shocked if the Jets lose this 4-2. I'd be curious to know your score predictions. Drop them in the comments below. But my personal feeling, if this is your season opener, would have been nice to not have to play the Oilers. Edmonton is a really annoying team, and I would love, love, love to see the Jets come away with a big victory. Maybe even some power play opportunities where the Jets convert, stuff like that. But it's just the odds are really against the team this year. And I think Winnipeg just doesn't quite have, for me, the really elite punch that they need to go deep. They might be able to off the Oilers in a one-off sort of game like this, but, over the season series, potentially in a playoff matchup, I think you'll see why I continue to be a bit skeptical. But the good news is, if there is some good news, that the power play at least looks pretty great. So assuming that the Jets have that advantage tomorrow, that would be nice. But typically, I think the Oilers are going to be the ones that are going to get more of the power plays. It's one of the situations where you're going to probably take a few stick infractions, some tripping sorts of stuff, all that fun stuff when you're trying to slow down McDavid, Draisaitl, and company. I mean, McDavid doesn't always get those calls, but recently, he has been getting a few of them. So Winnipeg needs to be really disciplined because I don't think the PK, despite the systems change, is going to be able to stop Edmonton. No one else can, so why would the Jets, right? It's just one of those things where the natural talent that they have at their disposal is good enough to just pierce through any sort of defensive structure. So, yeah, I want to be optimistic, but I think you're starting to kind of hear my resignation in my voice. I feel like, what I had hoped for the start of the season isn't really happening, and running it back is going to be okay for the most part, but we all know where the problem is really going to start to appear. And kind of on that note, one thing that I wonder is how flexible is Arneal going to be when things stop working? This is maybe one of the biggest differences that I'm hopeful for between Arneal and maybe some of the other former coaches that have gone through Winnipeg, is that Arneal may be willing to make adjustments aggressively if things don't go well. And that could actually go a long way to starting to fix some of Winnipeg's lineup issues. But I want to chat about how likely I think he's going to be to experiment with stuff and whether or not it's really going to show up in a game like this, especially early in the season. We'll chat about that in just a quick moment. But before we go any further, did want to shout out our friends and partners at Indeed. We're all driven by the search for better, but when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. It's to match, and you can match with Indeed. Indeed helps you ditch the busy work by helping you schedule, screen, and message so you can connect with top candidates faster. And you don't just hire faster. 93% of employers agree that Indeed delivers the highest quality matches compared to other job sites. As somebody who was actually used Indeed when I was looking for work, I can personally attest to the fact that it was very convenient. The resume building system was super detailed and very to the point, very straightforward. I felt like I didn't really have to, jump through as many hoops to put together a profile that actually matched me to jobs that I'd be interested in, that met my salary requirements, and that aligned to my work experiences. I think Indeed's got a great algorithm for matching and connecting you to top jobs. And if you're an employer looking to hire, the inverse is obviously true. I mean, there's already over 3.5 million businesses worldwide that are using Indeed to offer employment. So you really should take advantage and join that group, because our listeners of the show even get a special $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/lockedon. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on the Locked On Winnipeg Jets podcast. That's Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions do apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode, as we are just wrapping up with some final thoughts on, obviously, an interesting upcoming season for the Jets. I feel like I was hoping for a little more out of preseason coming into the start of the year, but it seems like some of my expectations are going to have to be tempered a little bit. Not that I was expecting the Jets to be particularly great this year or to heavily invest in all of the youth making the team, but I did hope at least one player would maybe come out of camp and make the squad. Didn't really happen. So now we're running it back yet again, which, I know people are going to say, well, this was like 100, and 10-point team or whatever. And I think it misses the context of why running it back is a problem for the Jets. Running it back gets you through the regular season, no problem. Running it back gets you toasted when it comes to the playoffs. And that's where I think the Jets still have work to do to figure out how to get this roster from just being a playoff appearer to actually being a legit contender. If you lose in the first round in a close series and you actually played competitive hockey, I never complain. I don't mind that, because hockey can be really random, and sometimes you just get edged out on something that you don't have control over. But if you get smoked like the Jets did against the Avs, it shows you that there's a clear organizational mismatch between these teams. And I don't know who, the Jets are going to face in the playoffs this year, should they make it. But assuming it's a team that's on the level of Colorado or Dallas or one of these other squads, Winnipeg is going to be in tough. They just don't have the playoff elite depth that a lot of these other teams do. And so for me, I wonder, you know, in lieu of elite talent necessarily, will Arneal be flexible? Will he be open-minded? And for me, I feel like he's going back to some of the same things that were very familiar, but I don't understand why, because you have a clean slate, you have the ability to make changes, and if there was ever a time to experiment with your lineups and try and find new combos to optimize your roster build so that you don't have to have elite talent on every line, you can win by committee. I don't know why you wouldn't go that route. I mean, Connor Scheifele and Velarde haven't really proven that they can carry the load of this team. They can score, and they've done, a reasonable job at that. But in terms of like dictating the terms of play, controlling their matchups on the ice, all that stuff, they don't really have that advantage. They get outshot, they get outchanced, they give up, loads of high danger chances. And, the goal differential doesn't really look as kindly on them as you'd think, especially when you compare it to like Ehlers, Scheifele, and Velarde. That trio was phenomenal, much stronger. And like, if you put Connor on a second line or something, I really don't feel like it should be seen as a demotion. The Jets ideally could run two top lines. They have the talent to do that. If you had Connor, Nemesnikov, and Perfetti together, I think that trio would absolutely roast opponents. And that's after you have Ehlers, Scheifele, and Velarde to soften up the opposing top lines. If you run those, I think you'll have a much better chance at trying to dictate some of these matchups. You're still going to lose some of them, zero question. But I think in terms of what Winnipeg is capable of doing with what it has on hand, I think trying to optimize your lineup and experiment would be more helpful. And I think Arneal is at least, on paper more open to it, but I kind of worry that he's going to do a lot of the same bonus stuff where he's going to not really rely on Perfetti as much as he said he has or plans to. And then, we're going to see situations where Connor Scheifele and Velarde are overused. We're going to see the third line overused. And we're going to go back to the same things that have gotten this team in trouble in the past. And I worry that Arneal is not as much of a departure as I would like him to be. I think, I'm going to be open-minded. I'm going to be patient. I'm going to give him the time and space to, make the changes and adjust to the league. He says a lot of the right things, but so far I feel like the actions that I was hoping would follow his statements haven't quite reflected in the team. But again, it's still very early. We haven't even gone through game one yet. But if preseason is a sign of things to come, I just have concerns. And I don't want to be like a Debbie Downer because I think this team is still going to be a playoff team. I think they're still going to be pretty good in the regular season. But I think once you get to the playoffs, unless something drastically and massively changes, we're going to see a similar result where the Jets get bounced in 5 or 6 games, maybe less. I would love to have optimism about this team. I'd love to feel like the Jets are primed for greatness, but I'm just not seeing it. I think Winnipeg, if anything, is probably primed for an early playoff exit. And if that's the case, it just feels like a wasted opportunity. But it is what it is. Winnipeg is one of those teams that I think feels complacent in some areas in making the playoffs and that being their big goal for the year. I'd like it if maybe we could push for something a little more. And if Arneal is truly the guy that's wanting to, push the envelope and move the org forward, well, then he's got some serious work to prove it. I haven't really seen what I've wanted to see from him yet. I've heard what I wanted to hear, but the actions and stuff that I want him to follow through on, we haven't quite gotten that glimpse yet. So maybe in a few weeks I'll have a different tune. Maybe I'll be a little more optimistic. But so far, I just feel nothing but apprehension. But I'd be curious to know how you're feeling. Let me know in the comments below or at my social medias at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that is going to be all the time that we have. Tomorrow's episode, obviously, game day. Hoping for a big Jets win, hoping that they silence my doubts, make me look a fool. I suspect that's not going to happen, but sometimes the Jets do surprise us. But give me your score predictions for tomorrow as well. For tonight's episode, though, that is all the time that we have. Thank you so much for listening and making us your first listen of the day every day. We'll see you back here tomorrow, so be sure to like, follow, and subscribe. And as always, have a great night, and go Jets go.